Yeah.
Okay, do I have your permission to record?
Yes, you do.
All right, on the phone right now is Professor Andrew Fiala. He is the director of the Ethics Center, Fresno State. He's a professor of philosophy, and he's also on the editorial review board for the Journal of Ethical Perspectives. Recently, he wrote an opinion piece, I think a column, in a local newspaper here in California called America's Founding Fathers Listen to Each Other. We should not do any less. One of the phrases that grabbed me was, well, actually, let's stop there. Professor, did I miss anything on your introduction? Is there points you'd like to cover about your background, Professor?
No, that's fine. That's great. I do write that column on a weekly basis for the Fresno Bee, so I'm a weekly columnist on ethics and religion, writing for the Fresno Bee.
Okay, okay. And I, too, born and raised here in Fresno, so I saw the article. I just want to repeat a quote that got me from the article in the Fresno Bee titled America's Founding Fathers Listened to Each Other, so we should not do any less. A phrase from Thomas Jefferson explains the genteel dream of enlightened deliberation. In a letter to John Adams, Jefferson describes the two of them as rational friends, despite their deep disagreements. Jefferson said, "You and I differ, but we differ as rational friends, using the free exercise of our own reason and mutually indulging its errors. In these winter months, Americans no longer view one another as rational friends. We appear to lack a common vision of the good life. We believe in different facts. We suspect treasonous malice in the other, and we disagree about what is reasonable. This makes public deliberation impossible. The impeachment hearings are sterile debates, not collegial deliberations. The participants in these hearings do not listen. Instead, they talk past each other. Madison's remedy is the checks and balances of the Constitution. But we also need hope that this dark winter too shall pass. History moves in waves. There are moments of cold hearted darkness, but the spring will come again, so long as we don't burn the bridges that can lead us back to rational friendship." Professor, what did you mean in that particular section, and what was the meaning of that in the larger context of the column that you put in the Fresno Bee?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. So, yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess let me just start with the hope part, because I think that's really what we need these days. If you're on Facebook or watching the sort of media silos that we all live in, the picture you'll get is that your side is the rational side, your side, you're the good guys, and the other side are irrational, evil enemies.
Right, right.
And that is a huge problem in a democracy where we're supposed to share a common vision of the good life. Now, obviously we don't share a common vision of the good life, but that's the dream. That's the hope, right? So the hope piece has to do with at least believing that we can find something in common, some common ground where we could be that phrase rational friends, where we can agree, okay, we value this stuff in common, even though we disagree about a lot of other stuff. Here we can stand together. Here we can shake hands, here we can nod, here we can listen to one another and agree. And without hope of some common ground, then we really can't do democracy. Then it's just a matter of power and manipulation. And I've written about this in some other places as well, but this idea of hope is so important for ethics, for politics, and even for psychological existential life. We have to have a kind of hope that we can share a common world with other people.
I've been interviewing a variety of professors who write articles in the news over the last 6 months, a while, and only people who are reporters or professors on the topic of political division. Every single professor that I have talked to or reporter says, "Hey, I've been around for decades. I'm in maybe 40s or 60s years of age. It's as bad as I've ever seen it in 30, 40 years. Wow, is it bad?" And then I go, "So, what's the solution?" And they just have a blank look on their eyes. So, Professor, I got to ask, you're a professor. You're well studied on these issues. You study philosophy. You've also written articles on sovereignty and nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Why should people believe in hope? We have a lot of professors saying, wow, it's bad. I have no idea how it gets better. Tell the public why they should think that there's reason to hope.
Yeah, great question. I mean, one thing is, and we have this problem of historical myopia. Human beings, we look at things in a very small frame, right? We can't help it. We only live 70 years, 80 years. I mean, our frame of reference tends to be kind of narrow. But I think, and I've made this argument a number of times recently in public forums, if we just open our perspective to 100 years, 1,000 years, 3,000 years, we're still doing much better than previous eras of history. In the United States, there was a civil war, and we're clearly not there. That would be, even though people have used this rhetoric of there's a new civil war, that's actually impossible to imagine. Go back to the Reformation, when Christendom was falling apart, and there were, pogroms, and people were being burned at the stake. Before that, there were crusades. Go all the way back. And in my frame of reference, because I'm a philosopher, I go back to Socrates, and ancient Athens was a disaster. There was a big war going on. There was political intrigue, and then, of course, they murdered Socrates. So, in a sense, this is nothing new, right? So it's always been a process of people arguing against each other, war, violence, distrust, enmity. And the good news, again, so now back to where we are today, I think that despite the kind of dysfunction that we're seeing, the one sort of saving grace is the stability of the constitutional system. At least so far, so good. At least so far, people on all sides of this are playing by the rules of the constitutional system. So where we are today with the impeachment trial happening in the Senate, people are going through the motions, acting as if they believe in that constitutional system. They may be doing something manipulative or not believe it, when they go home, but the senators are sitting there listening to the presentations from both sides. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is there presiding. There's a kind of hope in that stability. Again, anything could happen, but I think again we're much better off than we were in the 1860s when the nation fell apart and there was literal bloodshed.
Fair enough. Couple things. I see a lot of the people saying America doesn't work because of the Constitution, because we have a Senate that just said, we're going to quit this guy. And they said it right after the things. And I have met many people, and I've seen many polls saying that is viewed by people as dysfunction, not a celebration of continuity, but, oh my God, is this what's... So let me repeat the question. Why should people have hope? You're saying, hey, well, the Constitution's being followed, and people are saying, yeah, the Constitution's being followed, and what we have is a Senate that elects Kavanaugh, allows a criminal to get away, and blocks all progressive legislation. I mean, it's a Senate that has horrible people get to the Supreme Court, protects criminals, and denies the right of the popular amount of the public to get the laws that they want, and that's baked into the Constitution. Why should people feel that that's a good thing, that the Senate works the way that it is, when it seems to be delivering multiple results the public isn't happy about?
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Sorry, tough question. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Let me reframe this slightly. So, one question is, what would be the alternative to the constitutional system and the Senate and the division of powers? And here's where I get very nervous: is that some people would argue, well, we need to scrap the whole thing, start over. Maybe now's the time for a revolution or something. And I think that's not right. Even though I've written, I've published quite a few places, like serious critique of the constitutional system. There's something kind of, I think, dysfunctional about the Electoral College, the fact that that small states get 2 senators just skews representation in a bizarre way. This Constitution is not a perfect document, but again, it provides a place of common ground, and we can again, back to hope. We can hope that the remedies are found within the Constitution itself. So, there will be elections after this year. It could turn out that there's a liberal wave that rises to power, and then new judges will be put on the Supreme Court, and it's a long process. And I think one of the worries I have is that, again, back to this thing about historical myopia, people get really worked up about today, this year, this decade, but the life of a democracy is long, provided it continues to live. But the life of any political system is long, and there's a big worry that one has, because if you give up hope in the system, then what's the next step? Well, now, next thing you know, we have revolutionaries, running in the streets, and I'm not sure that would give us any better solution. So again, I just summarize my comment here. It's not a great system we have. There's obvious dysfunction in it, but it's the system we have that creates a kind of stability and a place of common ground and agreement, hopefully.
So we have to have hope in the current system, because then what are we left with? Not the Constitution, and a journey into darkness. Okay. Well, let me throw out a couple statistics from some other scholars, and I'd like to get your opinion. So this is from Norman Ornstein. Norman Ornstein wrote this in 2018. He's a demographic expert for the Enterprise Institute and a couple others. Typically conservative, but he's had people from the Washington Post, a well-known liberal publication, say, this guy's right. So recently we had Professor Jonathan Taplin from the University of Southern California, Dean of the Annenberg School of Communication, literally requote Norman Ornstein. And this is what he said. I want to repeat a statistic I use. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of America will choose 70 senators. And that 30% will be older, much more white, much more rural, much more conservative, and more male than the rest of the country. Unsettling, to say the least. That was his quote. He was supported by Paul Waldman, a reporter for the Washington Post, who said, and added this: in the age of minority rule, a Supreme Court justice appointed by a president, they meant Kavanaugh, who got fewer votes, is confirmed by a party in the Senate that got fewer votes to validate policies opposed by most Americans. What they're saying is that you're going to have a Senate that continues to allow people like Donald Trump to get elected with the Electoral College, looks the other way at the corruption, appoints conservative Supreme Court justices, remakes the Supreme Court, remakes the lower circuit courts, so that they're conservative like they've been not since the 1970s, and basically blocks all progressive legislation. And unless the Constitution's changed, Norman Ornstein's saying that conservative rewrite of everything valuable for progressives is going to go on for the next 20 years. Why should we have hope, Professor?
It's a good question, and I don't dispute the basis of that either, which is I mentioned it earlier. The way that Senate, the 2 senators per state, and then you get a state like Wyoming or something that has more political clout in the Senate than the city of Fresno does. Population-wise.
Right.
It's a serious problem. So, in terms of 2 answers. Okay, one is in terms of hope for the long run. One thing is that the Constitution could be amended. There's a function within it that allows for that to happen. Again, though, your statistics could say that might be impossible, right? So if the demographic shift and we get sort of the 2 coasts and then the middle is the conservative part, it may be impossible to amend the Constitution.
Right.
So then what do we do, right? So that's a difficult question. I mean, how long do we play along with the system that on that analysis you just gave? is fundamentally undemocratic and broken? That's a tough question. But let me go back to another point to be made, which is that somehow, and this all the way goes back to this Thomas Jefferson conversation about rational friendship, somewhere in the background for me as a philosopher, and it may be naive, but somewhere in the background is this kind of hope that human nature itself contains an element of rationality, a moral core, an ethical set of virtues that human beings need to flourish. And we talked earlier that the history shows that there are some pretty bad episodes. But there's an alternative history which suggests that actually people are doing better and being better. There's a really great book by Steven Pinker, psychologist. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he makes this sustained argument about the fact that in a lot of ways, across the board, human beings are happier, healthier, we live longer, we're more rational. And then there's a story to be told there about the rise of science and the importance of education and the growth of literacy. And sort of this is not then about the Constitution, it's about human nature. Another piece of hope is that, science, education, literacy, and the rest of this stuff, including technology, is going to help us solve the problems that we have.
Right. It's certainly, I think you're getting at the arc of history. Generally, we're moving in the right direction. Things have gotten better. Certainly, when you look at the last 1,000 years, 100 years, everything's getting better. What grabs me, though, is Governor Gavin Newsom said a few months ago that America is 30 years behind California.
Mm.
What he meant was in the 1990s, we had our Donald Trump. He was called Pete Wilson. We had our backlash against diversity and immigrants. We tried to, ban all social services from immigrants and undocumented immigrants. We tried to make English the official language. We tried to repeal affirmative action. I remember living through the 90s. I'm half Latino. It was rough. People could walk up to your face and say mean things about being a Mexican anywhere you went. And if you wanted to get promoted, well, just didn't seem to happen as much for whatever good reason. And I remember African Americans were gunned down by the police and there would be no investigation and no protest. I certainly hear you that we're better, but is condemning Californians to going back to the 1990s because we have a federal government that will force us there a good thing to ask of us?
Yeah, no, and I, you're right that there are dark moments in this larger history. History doesn't just move in one direction. And what was really interesting about your comment is that it's local and regional, right? So there may be places of progress, the San Francisco Bay Area, I guess, for example, versus places where progress hasn't at all occurred. And you could think of foreign countries where, the theocratic nations that don't even have freedom of speech. I mean, we're going to have to really dig into the details when we're talking about the great big trajectory of history. But let's throw another item on the table, which is the demographic issue between the young and the old. And there was recently something in the news about the coming youth quake, right? There's going to be another kind of baby boom. Young people are taking the lead. It also has to do with immigration and other kind of demographic transitions. And young people, in my estimation, I'm not a social scientist. I teach young people. But young people have a different set of priorities and a different set of values than the old folks. So, like, for example, with regard to race and racism, in my estimation, that tends to be something more associated with an older generation than a younger generation. Now, I'm sure there are young people who are racists. I don't want to, there's no doubt that there are young racists. But if you think about what our educational system in California especially has done in the past 30 years, 40 years, It's all been about inclusivity, about respect for difference. And that's a kind of a good news story. What we need to have happen is for those young people with that different, more inclusive, more progressive set of values, we need for them to take leadership positions. We need for them to gain power. And now think about this history in terms of uh, Obama-Trump trajectory. Obama was basically my generation. I'm a 50-something person. And we grew up, at least I did, with a feminist mother, parents who understood the need to respect people's differences. And Obama was the leading edge of the wave of leaders that's my generation who I think have those values. Trump is a throwback to an older set of values. And so, in a sense, in terms of hope, we just wait for that generation to get out of the way. And the hope is that the younger generation can come in with a new set of values that's not going to tolerate some of that nonsense from that older generation.
I certainly hope so. I got to say, though, that when I look at the statistics on voting, the average voter is typically 30 or 40 or 50 years of age. They are not 20. There was certainly an uptick with Obama's first election, but that uptick was gone by his second election. So the youth were activated once, and then they went right back to their cubbyhole. And typically we have voters that aren't voting right when they're 18. They're voting when they get older. So let's say there's the youth bulge. They have the right ideas, but for statistically keeping the pattern that's been there for a century, they don't vote till they get older. Till they got kids, they got property, they're paying taxes. Yeah, maybe you get them out there for one election here or there, but consistent voting every single time the way my grandparents do it. What if we have to wait another 20 years to get that demographic shift? Are we telling people that the winter that will pass, just wait 2 decades?
I hear you on that question. Well, and you could add in, by the way, that old people live longer, right?
Exactly.
So, in a sense, how long will it take?
Yeah.
Well, so again, back to maybe shift the conversation a bit to a proposed remedy, which is to educate the youth better and mobilize them and get them to engage and enact democracy. And this goes back to this problem of cynicism again, where if young people believe that this system is broken and corrupt fundamentally, that there is no sense in playing along with the system, this means they won't vote, right? If young people think that look, the Senate is broken, this impeachment is what this is showing us, I can imagine a 20-something thinking, what the lesson to be learned is that bad guys win, that criminals get away with it, that the system is rigged, that the rich and powerful rule the roost, and that decency and honor don't matter, right? I can imagine a 20-year-old taking away that lesson. And obviously, from my standpoint, that's the wrong lesson. The lesson ought to be, well, when this kind of stuff happens, those of us who believe in ethics and integrity and honor and democracy, we need to get even more engaged and go out and try to make sure that this isn't true, right? We need to engage the public to show that we won't tolerate this kind of thing. And so how does that happen? How do we do that? Again, I think we need to better educate the youth and better encourage them to take advantage of the resources in the system itself. So, young people obviously need to vote, but democracy is more than voting. It's writing letters, it's engaging in public discourse, it's going to political rallies, it's working, for the betterment of the community locally and nationally. That kind of service and engaged citizenship, ultimately for me, that is the remedy. It happens in the schools, but it's also more than the schools. It's our whole attitude and nurturance towards young people. And boy, one of the saddest things, I would think, is if young people give up hope and succumb to cynicism, because then guess what happens? They withdraw. They're going to just sit on their couches and complain and play video games, and then nothing changes.
2016. there were two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Here in California, Bernie Sanders was incredibly popular. I have met thousands of people under 35 who feel that the Democratic Party, I'm not saying I agree with this, I'm just saying what I've heard. Thousands of people under 35 here in California say democracy's broken and elections are rigged because of the Democratic Party in the 2016 primary here in California, and something called the crossover ballot controversy, where if you didn't specifically use the term crossover ballot, you were not given the proper instructions by your county registrar so that you could actually vote in the primary. Thousands upon thousands of people here in California under 35 were not able to vote for Bernie in the primary, felt that they were tricked and rigged, and they're blaming the Democrats. Now you look and see the Republicans are willing to rig a national election. What reason do those people have to believe that they could have faith in the system?
Good question, Marcus. You're asking really great questions here.
Thank you. Hey, thank you. And I don't mean to be rough. This is why I go for reporters and professors. I don't know the answer. You're one of the best educated people here. So if there is no answer, I'd like to hear it from an expert going, boy, I don't know, because that at least informs the rest of us who aren't as educated and frankly don't have the time to stay up on these things. This is a big issue, and they don't know. Watch out.
I appreciate it, yep. Yeah, well, yes, so what you said about sort of the distrust in the party system and the electoral system, that's a huge, huge problem. And I know what you're talking about, and there's been claims about this for a long time, going back to the George W. Bush era.
Yep, thank you.
I have friends who were, they claimed that there was rigging of the election in Ohio, and then even before that, remember the hanging chads and the Supreme Court decision that put Bush into office.
Yep, thank you. No one remembers that at all. No one talks about that. No one remembers that at all.
Yeah. No, this is 20 years or more of distrust in the electoral system. And then, of course, you hear the same point has been made by Trump repeatedly, because he claims, even before he was elected, he said that the electoral system is rigged. He meant that it was going to be rigged on behalf of the Democrats. And even after he was elected, he continued to make the case that the election was rigged, which had something to do with his claim about the popular vote, right? So, this is a fundamental problem in democracy. If people don't believe that their vote matters, if people believe the electoral system is rigged, then we got all kinds of problems that follow from that. At the very least, people just are not going to vote, right? The bigger problem is that there's then a question of legitimacy. If a government, if a candidate or whoever wins, and they were not elected fairly, there's no reason to then believe that that government is legitimate, in which case people distrust it, will act against it. Why obey the law if the law is made by an illegitimate government? And then we have this, spin that out. We have to worry about revolution, and anarchy creeps back in again. This is a huge, huge problem. And in fact, I actually have more data on this. I could pull it up for you, but I believe I gave a presentation on this recently, that there's the polarization in our country reflects distrust of electoral politics, meaning Democrats believe that Republicans tend to cheat, and Republicans believe that Democrats tend to cheat. And some of this has to do with voter suppression, right? So Democrats will claim that Republicans are suppressing the vote. The Republicans will claim the reverse with regard to Democrats, that there's phony people voting because voter registration and so on and so forth. Man, this is a big, big problem. One bit of hope, since we're trying to talk about hope, is there's some interesting data. I'm not a social scientist again. I have to dig this up to get the details, but people tend to believe and trust local elections more than they do, bigger elections, national elections. When you talk about, the vote for mayor or city council or whatever, people tend to think, well, our local people are honest and can be trusted. And then what happens is the larger the entity becomes, right? So now if we're talking about the Democratic Party or something, or state level elections, people get a little bit more cynical the larger it is. And this kind of tells us something, I think, which is that for democracy to work, it has to have that local component where people know each other enough that they can trust each other. And one of the things that is a big problem in our current situation is we've got a country of 350, 400 million people, and we don't know each other, and we have no reason to trust each other because we don't know anything about, people in California don't know anything about people in Wyoming, and people in Ohio don't know anything about people in Wisconsin, and this is a big, big problem in political philosophy. Aristotle, all the way back to Aristotle, he, sort of had this idea that democracy would be in a nice small community. For democracy to work, there's an optimal size, and it's not a country of 350 million people. Everything gets too diffused. We don't know each other. We don't trust each other, and that's a problem.
Good stuff. Okay, so to summarize for everybody listening in, things look bad. However, we can have hope that the youth will come to their senses, engage in voting like never before, and stay consistent with the voting, although that trend hasn't happened. But maybe it will happen. It'll be the first time. Let's say that happens. Let's say that despite the statistics, the youth say, we're all going to vote, and we're going to keep voting every single year. First time it's ever happened in American political history, but it's going to happen. We've had enough. We're not racist. We're going to put things on the right track. I got to bring you back to the Norman Ornstein quote. Up to 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% will choose 70 senators. And that 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, and more male. So you have the youth voting. And then you have old people in 35 states where there really isn't youth who are progressive because they don't want to live there. Immigrants don't move there. LGBTQ people leave because they're scared. So you're pretty much old, white, rural, conservative, right. Fox News living. And you have 2/3 of the Senate. What does it matter if you get every single youth person activated outside of those states? Nothing they vote for is ever going to happen.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is a bleak picture that can be drawn from this. And in fact, I've made this argument about the constitutional system in a book that I wrote, which is about the title of the book is Against Religions, Wars, and States. And there's a kind of anarchism, I call it philosophical anarchism, that can come out of the kind of analysis you just presented. And in a sense, I guess I am a philosophical anarchist insofar as no political system lives up to the standards of its own highest aspiration. There's a fundamental problem, right? So if you have the social contract theory of the state, which says that we should all agree to be ruled by the laws because we all get a say in it, and then that leads to a constitutional system that disenfranchises people, and sort of, as you pointed out, with regard to this disparity in the Senate, there's a conclusion about that, which is, well, the system is broken, there's no reason to obey the laws, and we end up with this kind of anarchist outcome. Philosophers have been talking about this for thousands of years, and it's a plausible conclusion, right? The conclusion being that, well, the system's broken, can't be fixed, and it's fundamentally corrupt, flawed, and then basically illegitimate. So that's, I'm willing to go there as a philosopher.
Sure,
as
sure,
a theoretician
sure.
To talk
Theoretically, theoretically, this is all theory.
Yeah.
But what happens in 20 years?
So then what? So now the question is, what does a citizen do? So it turns out, I think, there's no place else we can go. People talk about moving to Canada or something. Well, there's costs to that sort of thing. I mean, we're here, right? We're members and participants of this experiment in democracy called the United States. So my conclusion is, until the anarchist utopia happens, which is never. Now we have to find a way to work within the systems that we have. And the only thing we can do is to try to find ways to reform the system, to correct it, to prevent its worst outcomes from happening. So in light of the analysis that you've given from Ornstein, maybe what has to happen is we need to come up with a reform of the constitutional system that gives the Senate less power or changes the way that senators are selected. I mean, we need to come up with some proposals that fit within the system. Of course, given the analysis you just gave, that's going to be very difficult because any chance of getting a constitutional amendment requires, a huge hurdle to pass over. And as you said, the demographic shift makes it seem like that hurdle would be impossible to jump over. So what do we do? Well, I think the worst thing we could do is give up hope, which means that everybody just withdraws from the project. And then the worst characters, the worst players will certainly take advantage. I think we kind of have an obligation, I do, as an educator, to make the best argument that young people and Americans in general need to get involved, need to think about these problems in our democracy, and need to engage the democratic process itself. It's not a perfect solution. No, in life there are no panaceas. There's no, you can't take a pill and fix things. It's just ongoing struggle. And we learned that from the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. That lasted over a year, and it was strategic and it was hard, and it failed more often than not. But you have to keep working at it, and you have to have smart people, engaged people, putting all their passion behind trying to find a way to fix this place.
Right. I do recall, though, that with the Montgomery bus boycott, absolutely, you had the youth. I think it was the student lunch counter-protest was led by the university students, and that helped get it going. However, it was when these students were arrested and older middle-class African Americans started to protest in the streets, not youth, that they got the critical numbers. And when those people harassed, it was older middle-class white Americans that got a step and started voting. So civil rights movement, there was a lot of youth, and we talk about that, but nothing happened until older middle-class people actually started getting involved.
Yeah.
So I understand. Hopefully the youth come here, they do this, but I got to point out something. I did an interview recently with political science professor Ross K. Baker from Rutgers, and he said hope too, that he hopes the Senate gets better, but that he did not see a chance that structural change would ever happen for the reasons you just cited. You got 70% of the Senate, they're old, rural, Fox News loving. They don't care what the youth said, and they're not going to allow it to be reformed. So let's say you get all the youth involved, and it's just until you're ready to get young people to move to the center of North Dakota.
Move to Wyoming,
or Tennessee, which I got to tell you, I've talked to young people and say, hey, how about moving to frozen South Dakota? And I show them a picture from here in California. Professor, there's no takers. So
yeah, I know.
How demographics is going to happen, you get all the youth activated if you can, which has never happened before. But let's say it does. They're still outvoted. Then what?
Yeah, well, this is, it's, again, luckily, I'm a philosopher and not an activist.
Sure.
So, it could be, Marcus, let's be honest about this.
Fair enough.
I started our conversation with reference to Athens and Socrates, and there is a dark story to be told, which is that the reasonable people get killed, or get excluded, or get ostracized, or whatever. Hope is only one thing, right? There also is reality, and I mean, it could be that things get a lot worse. You can't rule that out again, right? Nobody can read the future. But let me say this again about why I like the concept of hope as a philosopher. What's important for me about it is that hope is not just to say, well, I hope it gets better, and then that's it, like period, the end. Hope comes with a whole set of imperatives, which it requires action. It's not enough. I don't mean hope as a sense of like, yeah, it would be nice if this happened. What I mean by hope is that then impels us to act and impels us to think and impels us to make arguments. And I think let me throw one more kind of piece of evidence for hope, maybe, which is that philosophers have argued that reason actually matters. And at the end of the day, there is a sense of logic and science that should come out, right? So if these senators from these small states that are, voted in by white majority conservative folks, if they make bad arguments, eventually those bad arguments start to stink, and people know that there's something corrupt going on. Again, it's true that it doesn't always work that way. But if we as a country can encourage this sense of reason and rationality, and this goes back to what Thomas Jefferson was talking about in that article too, when he says we need to be rational friends, what he means is our friendship needs to be based on a common logic, a common reason, a common set of principles. And there's a problem there too, because some people reject science, some people deny climate change, some people don't believe in evolution. So we got a whole set of issues that come along with that. But the hope that the philosophers have is that we could teach people to be more reasonable and encourage them to make better arguments.
Yes, that would be the hope, and maybe that will happen. I do see a Senate that confirmed Kavanaugh 2 years ago, when most of America didn't want that, and now I see a Senate that said we're going to let a criminal off when that's not what people want, and they're going to get away with it. And I think there was one senator that got in a tough spot, for their backing of Kavanaugh, 1 out of 100, and that's not a big backlash. And then there was the 2018 blue wave, and Van Jones said, well, it wasn't really a blue wave, it was kind of purple districts, and you swung them blue, but they weren't exactly red anyways. And then we have Donald Trump saying Mexicans are rapists and murderers, and 51% of the population outside of California on Election Day said that's our guy. So Trump lost the popular vote exclusively because of California, which means outside of our borders, a majority of our fellow Americans said, yeah, the guy who says to victimize women and hates all Muslims and Mexicans are rapists, that's our dude, a majority of Americans. Then we fast forward to when he said, send them back? I think that was last year. He made a comment about 3 or 4 legislators, and he said send them back, although they were all citizens. His approval rating went up, according to Zarbi, to 51%, which means, again, outside of California, 55%. So, and his base has effectively not moved at all throughout the entire impeachment proceedings. I got to ask, what reason do we have to hope that people will come to their senses when they haven't over all this over the last couple of years? How much worse does it have to get?
No, and let's throw in climate denial, climate science denial, and even remember Trump altering the weather map.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many things that you'd think at some point people are going to say this is unreasonable.
But it never happened.
The arguments don't work. It doesn't work. So no, it's obviously a problem. So what do we do about this? As an educator, my remedy is education. We need to teach people, that you can't contradict yourself. We need to teach people what good arguments look like and what bad arguments look like. Teach people, we need science literacy, we need religious literacy, we need constitutional literacy. All of that's a big project, right? We need to, and this has to be across the country.
National.
And now, we could throw in. I'm sure you would throw in. I mean, the cynical, critical worry is that we have places in the United States that still want to deny that evolution is a legitimate scientific theory,
right.
and the textbook controversy about evolution. I mean,
right.
Right. I mean, these are huge and complicated problems, and there's a bunch of misunderstanding about, I think, our own constitutional history. There's people who still want to claim that the Civil War, that the South was justified. You know what I mean? Like there's serious misinformation and misunderstanding about our own history. And again, from a philosophy, from an education standpoint, the solution has got to be better education, better ideas, better thinking. There's not a panacea. It's a person by person, moment by moment, year by year process, and it's difficult.
I'd like to make one point, and then I want to ask you two controversial questions. This is something we always do. You don't have to answer, but they're ideas proposed by other professors. The comment I'd like to make is, totally agree with you, education could fix all this. But if we're going to do a good education at a national level, that means the Senate would have to approve, which brings us right back to square one.
So back to our problem.
So here's two things. We had talked to Professor Jonathan Taplin, and he wrote an editorial. LA Times came out last couple months, and he was pointing at Norman Orstein's demographic, and he said this: you know what? Maybe it's time for us liberal blue states to take up states' rights the way conservatives did in the 60s. And I mean, get downright radical with it. If we don't have faith that they're going to follow our laws, we just start doing our own thing, like we've done on climate change, undocumented immigration, marijuana. We don't dabble. We go all committed in. What do you think about Professor Jonathan Taplin's suggestion made to Californians recently in the LA Times article?
I don't know that. I haven't read that piece, but I think there's something to that. And what I'm hearing in the background of that claim is that there's more than just the democratic system. There's also the courts system, and we have three parts of this government. And so there are strategies that involve the courts. You saw this recent one. These young people sued about climate change, and they claimed that their right to a healthy environment was being violated. And that, I believe, right now, I think this week there was a decision by a few judges on the Ninth Circuit, and now that's going to go. I think they've appealed. They want the whole circuit to review that one more time. So there are strategies within the system, including the appeal to states' rights that's connected to the judicial branch. And here's another proposal I saw recently, which is that we should add more states to the union.
Right.
There are places like Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. It's actually a crime with the status of Puerto Rico. If we could add 2 or 3 states or divide California into several states, I mean, there are these remedies that then would change the dynamic in the Senate, as you pointed out, because then we have more states with more senators. So some of those, I think those are all interesting, challenging, of course, again, because of the way the system works. But I think it's useful to imagine those challenges and those solutions kind of within the structure itself.
The professor saying we just keep doing what we're doing, keep lawsuits, and basically just occasionally ignore federal law and say, come out here and enforce it if you're going to make us do it. Not get violent, but just say, we're not doing that. If you want to send people out here, and because we're so big, they just would run out of energy.
Yeah, no, and well, look what happened with the legalization of gay marriage, where there was this back and forth. It was legalized in one state or another, then it became illegal because of a federal decision, and then ultimately it made its way to the Supreme Court in that Obergefell v. Hodges decision of, I don't know, like 5 or 8 years ago. That's one of those, that was actually a successful strategy, if you think about it, right? So the states pass their own permission of gay marriage, and then you got this problem across state borders of, eventually the country as a whole has to take it up. I predict something like that's going to happen with marijuana also. As more and more states legalize marijuana, then there's going to be this conflict across the nation and the difference between state law and federal law, and then the courts have to take it up. So I think that is a useful strategy.
Uh, I want to ask you one last question, but I want to make a statement. Again, there is proposals to fix all of this in America by getting rid of the Electoral College, adding more states so you can get
Right.
more liberal senators, um,
Hmm.
changing the way the allotment of senators per state. And all of
Hmm.
that, again, will never happen if a majority of the Senate is conservative and knows damn well you're letting in liberal Puerto Rico, liberal D.C., etc.
Right.
So solutions, but it ultimately comes back to you got to convince these people to allow that to pass and say, hey,
Yeah.
we want you to make yourself more liberal. Oh, are you conservative? Yeah, but vote this in so that liberal agenda is locked into the future. When we asked
Yeah.
Ross K. Baker, professor of political science at Rutgers, he said that ain't ever going to happen. So I'm not saying if it will or not. That's Professor Ross K. Baker at Rutgers. But here's another idea we had heard. Recently, there's a professor, former speechwriter for Donald Trump, former transition aide for Donald Trump, and he has a book out called, I forget the title, but it's by F.H. Buckley. Not a silly man. He's a professor of law at George Mason University. And he is suggesting that maybe the way to end the division is for conservatives in America to pass an amendment to allow California to have Quebec style policy freedoms. So you keep everything on
Aha.
this.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
So you go, okay, California, you're really upset at what we're doing. Here, you get these issues where you get to run climate change how you want, but you don't get to participate in the debate on how the rest of us run climate change. So you get your policy freedoms. We'll never mess with you. Still in the U.S., Quebec style freedom, but in return, you step out of those issues that you're getting policy freedom on. What do you think about that idea, Professor?
Yeah. Well, this in some of my writing where I talk about anarchism, there is sort of this devolution of power strategy, which the Quebec example is one of those cases. You see what's happening with Brexit now, where the British are trying to pull out of this larger alliance. There is something to be said for local control and regional autonomy, and that is connected to that states' rights issue as well. And I think there's something to that about respecting the different values of different regions. But the danger is, of course, that this all of these arguments is what led to the Civil War 125 years ago, 50 years ago. You run into this problem where if regions or states or localities try to have a different legal system, eventually you could have backlash, and then you get the federal government showing up, and then you can get violence happening. This happened, of course, I would argue, on the right side when they were trying to integrate schools back in the 1950s, and the federal authorities went into southern states and said, no, sorry, you have to do this. Yeah, no, it's a challenge, but there is something very interesting about regionalism and localism, and the idea that we could sort of have more autonomy at the local level. Further difficulty, though, of course, is that we actually are more integrated now than we ever have been in terms of the economy, in terms of popular culture, in terms of the way that science and academia works. Almost every academic is from somewhere else. We're not. None of this stuff is local. It's all national or international. And that's actually another place to find some resources and some hope here is that maybe there's a kind of cosmopolitan internationalism that's at play in all of this. It's not to be forgotten, that there is such a thing as the United Nations and the UN Declaration of Human Rights and all this other stuff. Again, as problematic as all the rest of it, as complicated as all the rest.
Interesting. Looking at other international examples, yes, because we can see Scotland and Catalonia and New
Yeah.
Caledonia and Bougainville, I think, just passed a peaceful vote after 20 years of civil war, completely peaceful vote to break away from New Guinea. And we saw a
Yeah.
peaceful
Wow.
vote in Scotland.
Yeah.
So maybe there is a model there that we're starting to see little regions say, let's have a peaceful vote to negotiate over a couple of years for us to be a little bit different. Scotland did it, Quebec did it. As I understand,
Yeah.
this form of federalism is found in Canada, England, India, Australia.
Mm.
Those are English-speaking countries that are democracies.
Yeah.
Couldn't that work here in America?
Yeah. That would really be interesting. I mean, the details would matter, and you've seen these proposals for people talking even about seceding. California secedes somehow.
Right, right.
Um,
One third
who
of
knows if
California
that
was
would?
for that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, who knows if that would ever be possible or a good idea?
Sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, here. I mean, my vision. Again, I've written about this. There's these two kind of interesting rival forces at play in the world these days. One is a cosmopolitan internationalism, where we are more integrated across borders than we've ever been, and the other is this move towards localism and regionalism, like some of the examples you gave. And that's even, I mean, even like more local. There are people talking about bioregionalism with regard to agriculture, and staying close to home because that's better for the environment and so on. These two rival forces are, who knows what's going to happen with them. The cosmopolitan international part of this is worth considering. That despite protectionism, we're part of the global economy, and people come here and we send products there, and there are lots of cross-border interactions. And there's actually another, since we've been talking about hope, another kind of hopeful piece to this is that, the Trump moment is happening, but the global integration moment is also happening. And there's only so far that we can pull ourselves out of that global system, and then things really start to fall apart. So, all of the stuff with the trade war and the tariffs is in play here too, right? So we sort of, for our own self-interest, need to play by the norms of the international community to an extent. Of course, very complicated. But you saw it this week while Trump's being impeached. He also went to Davos and spoke to the, global leaders in business. So there's this whole other game going on, which has to do with globalism, globalization, the integration of the global economy, which again is complicated. There are some terrible things about that in terms of the way that capital flows across borders, but human beings cannot because of border restrictions. But those forces are also at play. So back to, like, if I'm talking to young people about this, if they're looking for some hope again, well, this demographic shift we're talking about in the United States is also being paralleled by this very interesting integration that's happening, where young people are talking, young Americans are talking to young people in India about democracy and human rights. And the protesters in Hong Kong are being supported by people in San Francisco. That's another very interesting place to look at, how is change going to happen? Well, it's not just isolated here. It's a global movement in a sense.
I hope so. I really do. I found it exceptionally. I was very saddened to see Catalonia people wanted to have a vote for independence, and they were beaten, had their heads cracked open, and they sent SWAT teams to where they had the ballots at gunpoint and demanded the votes from them, and then arrested their leaders. And nobody really in America or Europe seriously condemned that. And then they went on and said, oh, yeah, we're about democracy. Really? Really?
Yeah.
And
this is the crackdown in Hong Kong has been equally dispiriting.
True.
And the Arab Spring of 12 years ago or whenever that Arab Springs thing happened 10 years ago, that basically the authoritarians basically cracked down against that. There's a sad history to be told about all this as well. You're right.
Well, I'm just curious because we have the West saying, "Oh, China, you're bad because you beat up people who just wanted to have a vote, and you threatened them with machine guns, and you cracked heads, and you arrested political leaders, and that's wrong," which it is. And then when Spain did all those same things, they said nothing. Why would someone in
Yeah,
the world buy the West and not believe that we're total hypocrites?
yeah. Well, yeah, no, you're right. This is there's the politics of convenience and self-interest involved in all of this. Marcus, I'm looking at
Oh,
my
yep,
clock.
yep. Thank you very much.
I need to move on.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I will send this to you very shortly.
Yeah, when you get it posted or whatever, I'm happy to take a look at it. Thank you very much for the very interesting conversation. You're asking great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor. I'll send it to you shortly.
Good luck. Bye bye.
Bye.